The next one lined up is by the same guy. It is Pancreas No Work. And this one is about why Warhammer Fantasy is better than 40k. This is his video essay on why Warhammer Fantasy is better than 40k. Now, I'm not sure exactly how true that is of a statement. I only know so much about the fantasy setting. I'm only just now getting into it through the previous video and this one. So my mileage on it is going to vary. But I do find that the appeal of 40k does outweigh the appeal of the fantasy setting. And though I am more so of a medieval fantasy type of guy when it comes to RPGs, I will admit that an RPG in a science fiction that borders on the fantasy type of way of, of doing things is just as appealing. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I like Star Wars so much as a kid. It's because it had all of my favorite things. It had warrior monks with laser swords, and everyone was fun, and everyone just dressed fancily, and everybody was really cool. Everybody was just really cool, and they also used the Force, which was a form of magic that seemed very interesting and somewhat easy to understand. At least for the most part, its application was easy to understand. But anyways, yes. Moving on from that. Warhammer Fantasy being better than 40k is a debate in my mind, because while I still don't understand too much about the fantasy Warhammer setting, I do find that the Space Marines, the interesting relationships that they have with their Primarchs and the God Emperor, among other things, and how everything got as fucked as it was, they are all interesting little facets to the 40k story that make it so compelling in the first place. Whereas this particular version of Warhammer, the fantasy part of it, while it has a lot of interesting factions, they have their own little particular flavor and sort of spice that they add to the setting. I feel like it's gotta be a clusterfuck to manage on some level, because it's a lot. It's a lot of factions. How do normal people function in this godforsaken world? That is a question that I want answered, because it doesn't make sense. 40k at least bothers to try to make some sense out of it. Fantasy Warhammer just seems inconceivable to me. It's just like, how does anyone live in any capacity in this world outside of just like the major holdings for which most of the cities and towns are based around? Like, you have to imagine that being a villager in the middle of some buttfuck nowhere place must be just the most awful fucking existence you could possibly imagine, because at any point in any given time, you could just be raided by marauders, pirates, other races, other factions, and it would just be on a random day, potentially a Tuesday. And I would imagine, right, that in this setting, where everyone is at war almost at all times, like, you probably would have to be migrating almost daily. So it's like, I can't imagine this setting being a fun place to live in, and I can't imagine any real type of commerce as well as acceptable form of living would exist in this setting. But, maybe it's just because I've not seen the overall bigger picture of how this world works. The other aspect of it that doesn't appeal to me nearly as much is that because there are so many factions, there's so little depth to go around, right? And the other factions in 40k have some depth, and it's depth that actually makes it work for its setting, as well as the way it characterizes the factions, because everything is tangled into each other in some way or another. All right, the Eldar are playing games with the Imperium, with other factions, and some of those factions are the way that they are because of other factions, among other things, right? Everything ties into one another in a very interesting yet intricate way, almost convolutedly so. But Warhammer Fantasy just seems like everyone has their own thing going on, and everyone is kind of shitting on their own lawns and are currently overstepping boundaries and they feel the need to correct it. That's the most of the vibes that I'm getting. But anyways, we shall ignore my ramblings now. Let's get into it. The why Warhammer Fantasy is better than 40k. Let us do it.
It's been a while since I've done a bit of a rambling opinion piece, and I figured for this one I'd just flop my schmeat onto the table for all to see and judge. As you can probably guess from the title, I think Warhammer Fantasy is a better setting than Warhammer 40k. I much prefer it to 40k for a whole variety of reasons, and I figured I'd tell you all those reasons a little more low-key of a video while the Malekith one is waiting to come out and the Tau Do or Don't is in the works. Probably shouldn't have to tell you this, but this is my opinion, not the word of Christ Almighty himself. So if I say something here you disagree with, that's okay. Opinions are nice like that, there's rarely a single correct one. This is a Warhammer YouTube channel, not a congressional hearing. But I'll throw some actual reasons your way too, just to pretend I can analyze these settings at a level approaching rational thought. So sit back and enjoy the background Total War footage with occasional pictures while I lay my smooth-brained thought processes out for you. But before I go on, look at this really quickly. One, I'd be terribly grateful if you did what it says, but also I want to give a massive thanks to Barry Waltz for throwing this together for me. I made a silly, poorly edited meme when he overtook me in subs. He gives me something I can use for the rest of my YouTube career. What a class act, that Barry. I don't know how to get rid of the black bar or the green screen, so it's going to stay like this and add to the general trashy feel of my channel. Not that it's trashy itself, it's just me handling anything someone gives me as trashy, you see. Anyways, I don't know what I'm doing. Time to talk about why I think fantasy is better. First of all, and this is a reason that can't really be debated unlike some of the others because it's just personal taste, I prefer fantasy to sci-fi. I like dragons and wizards more than I like spaceship fights and planetary bombardment. Don't get
I mean, that's fair. I feel the same way about it. I feel like there's something more grounded about having your boots on the ground, getting your hands dirty. There's just something more visceral about, like taking a sword, plunging it into people. There's just it's a lot more personable than just taking cover and just clicking a button and then everything dies. It's a very different game. And I feel like that in itself is the major appeal as to why I like fantasy as well. For me in particular, but granted, right, 40k has a level of science fiction fantasy that I actually like, which is that guns don't just automatically kill people unless you're human. If you're a space marine, it takes a little bit more than just a bit of shooty bang bang to take down a space marine. It takes something much sturdier. It takes either multiple bolter shots into a particular part of the armor, the abdomen or whatever, to take down a space marine. It takes also maybe like a decently well-placed plasma shot. It probably takes a giant plasma gun to do it. It probably will take a lot more to bring down a fast-moving juggernaut of a fucking tank it'll take something pretty great to take down a space marine, on top of the fact that it's already a genetically altered, biologically engineered, roided out fucking behemoth of a human being and just tank-like armor. It is a beast of a goddamn faction, the Space Marines, and I would pity the motherfucker who has to deal with that shit. I mean, if it wasn't already bad enough that the Space Marines have an honor and a code that they live by more often than not, depending on the legions we're talking about, most of them are very much like they have their own set of guidelines, principles, and things that they live by, their own sort of codes of honor, so to speak. But if you're unlucky to, like, say, meet the Night Lords, for example, you're gonna have a bad time. You're just gonna have a fucking bad time of it. But yeah, it's I personally like the 40k version of things because, not only are things just fucking wild in the 40k setting, but there is still that level of almost fantasy-like elements. There is the viscera. There is the up-close and personal type of combat that makes it so meaty, right? That it's not just about the shooty bang bang elements. It is that just instantly kill people. It's also like you have the chain swords, you have the power swords, you have all of the things that still give it that level and era of combat where it's like skill meets mastery meets idealism. It's like you still have that perfect story to be told in a way that allows for that argument to take place in both a literal sense and a figurative one. And I like that element. I love that in stories. That's why I like fantasy settings so much more, because a sword fight isn't always just a goddamn sword fight. A sword fight is like a battle of ideals. And Star Wars was like that for a while too. Like at least in the original shit. It was more so a battle of ideals. It was a battle of good versus evil. It was a battle of what's really true. Is it might makes right, or is it compassion and kindness that will win the day? It is the ever evolving, continuously telling stories that we've all seen in plenty of other fictions, but just told much more groundedly and much more masterfully in a visual representation in the form of laser swords beating against other laser swords. But that's neither here or there. I love any story that focuses on trying to tell us a story through not just the figurative sense, but in the physical one as well. I feel like the story makes is more palpable and far more interesting when the stakes are equally just as shown in the way the characters perform skillfully, both in combat and out of it. I feel like there's a lot to be said here in this particular regard, but ultimately my love for fantasy is only as good as the story meeting the actual writing expression of the actual combat and the mechanisms at play, as well as just the overall just everything being told in a way that is just done in a way that's complementary. It all has to flow nicely together. It's done with a level of mastery. But I think you all get what I'm saying, right? I don't need to harp on this anymore. I like 40K in particular because it mixes technology with this aspect, and plus it's just a more involved, more well-defined universe, in my opinion, but we shall see, right?
Don't get me wrong, sci-fi is still amazing and I love it. I mean, I've got a Halo tattoo among other things, I gotta love sci-fi a bit, but I just prefer fantasy to it. That being said, there are still a few ways within the context of Warhammer that gives fantasy an edge over 40k in this department. Something I read online that I'm a big fan of quoting is that 40k is a fantasy setting cosplaying as science fiction. I mean, there's demons and hyperspace travel involves going through hell. I hope I'm not breaking anyone's mind by saying 40k isn't exactly hard science fiction. But it's still somewhat sci-fi, so this means it has to justify things a bit more than fantasy does. For example, psychic powers. In 40k, the Chaos Gods all have various things related to psychic powers and how souls work in the universe to explain how in a setting that's supposedly sci-fi, there's evil gods and demons. Each of them came about at various points in history in response to events in the material world. It's a similar situation with the old ones and their creations. The Eldar gods, for instance, might not be gods, but either manifestations of Eldar belief, or the old ones taking on the role of gods to survive. Either way, you get people like the Emperor taking on the argument that there are no gods in the setting, just things we don't understand that are evil and pretending to be gods. There's more work being done to justify why the setting is the way it is. Psychic powers themselves also suffer from a similar effect. You see, when Ahriman blasts some poor bastard with lightning, he's not using magic. It's actually psychic powers emanating from a realm beyond human comprehension. Totally not magic. Look at all these reasons we have listed for you that someone resurrecting with the power of someone else called the God Emperor isn't magic. You know what the justification is for there being gods and magic in Warhammer Fantasy? It's a fucking fantasy setting. Of course there's wizards and evil gods. They're just part of the setting. There's much less legwork needed to be done in order to make the setting work. There's also the advantage inherent in fantasy settings that people more or less know a lot about everything involved before they even get into the setting. For instance, high elves are going to be arrogant, aloof, and good at magic. Dwarfs like beer, live in mountains, and eat rocks. This makes the setting much easier to jump right into because if you're getting into Warhammer Fantasy, you presumably know what an elf is. Sure, the specifics might trip you up a bit, like orcs are a bit different in Warhammer than anywhere else, but you can get a handle on the broad strokes before you even read into the lore. Meanwhile, 40k has to explain pretty much everything. What's a Primarch? What's a Space Marine chapter? Why is everything heresy? Even if some of these things have simple answers, they still need answers, whereas with fantasy, you can just jump right into it. This makes it a lot easier to get into Warhammer Fantasy than 40k. For something a bit less meta, let's talk about the scale of the settings. Warhammer 40k is a gigantic blob of a science fiction universe. I mean, look at this map. There's a whole lot of diddly in the 40k galaxy. Now let's go back down to Warhammer Fantasy. It's a single world that looks a whole lot like Earth, with a not Atlantis right in the not Atlantic. Thankfully, there's still a landmass roughly equivalent to Florida, so rest assured there's certainly some lizardmen and or dark elves in that area high on bath salts. At first you might go bigger is better, and in some ways 40k's massive size does give it an advantage over fantasy. There's far more room for homebrews and large-scale adventures to take place in without upsetting the status quo, but that's very much a double-edged sword. There's plenty of downsides to it, and one is that the scale of 40k can keep individual achievements from meaning anything. Let's say some Chaos Lord blows up a planet. Okay. Cool, I guess. That's nothing. Inquisitors do that regularly. Biel-Tan regularly cleanses all life on a planet down to the bacteria on it. A character can conquer a system, and there'll be 100 like him who've done equally as much, if not more. But going back to fantasy, it's a single planet. Destroying certain cities can mean a whole lot, even though it's just a single city. It gives a much better scale of threat than GW having to just keep upping the amount of planets someone conquers to mean anything. There will always be more planets in the Imperium, just conquering one doesn't mean anything for a character. But if some guy and his band of Chaos Goobers take down a city at the edge of the Empire, that can mean something, depending on what.
He's got an interesting point on that regard. Like, I do feel like the scaling does kind of take away from some of the achievements you could have in the setting. So, in my opinion, though, because it focuses more so on scale, I think that puts that much more emphasis on the individual experience, right? I think the easiest way to get around this particular issue, in my opinion, not to take away from his argument too much, because it is a worthwhile argument and criticism. But I think the thing that would help to alleviate this issue, in both my opinion and also to help better support his opinion, would be like the simple answer of it, right? Being that you just make those individual stories feel much more weighty. You give them more impact, all right? Maybe you see the conflict of, like, say, for example, like you see a random planet in the Imperium being contested over and being taken over by a different faction, and you don't just see it from the lens of like the person conquering the thing or from the people who are trying to stand up against it, but rather you see it from like the perspective of, like, say, a whimsy child who doesn't know what the hell's going on, trying to make sense of everything, and watches as his entire planet burns to the ground, not sure what he's supposed to do about that. And then you go on from that, and then he grows up to maybe become, say, a Cadian, or a space marine, or a commissar, or whatever, and he essentially gets to take the fight to the war band that did it to his planet, right? Maybe he creates his own chapter after becoming decorated enough, and he eventually decides he's going to take that fight to that particular war band, and he's going to make it his personal mission to hunt them down to the ends of the earth, right? Or the ends of the galaxy. Like, there's an interesting, there's more room for telling more personable stories. Like the problem with scale is that if you're trying to tell meaningful stories that impact the setting, that's the difficult thing, to be sure. But with the way that Warhammer 40k focuses on it, and the way writers should focus on the setting, unlike some other ones, like, say, for example, Star Wars. Like, Star Wars has a massive setting. All of it is very superfluous to a degree, because every story tries to affect the setting in some form or another. But, like, outside of, like, the trying to affect the setting more, like, more holistically, like, Star Wars rarely ever tells meaningful stories about personal achievement and personal tales of stakes that require personal, like, struggles and upheavals. And it's not as important as the overall way that it impacts the wider story, which I feel like is kind of the problem with Star Wars, because a lot of Star Wars media tends to focus on you being like almost a chosen one as character, or tries to take more of a power role in how things play out in the grander schemes of the galaxy as well as the universe. But I think that if you were to take away that level of agency and focus more on a specific tale, there's certainly something to be had there. The problem, of course, though, is that, like, let's take, for example, Jedi Survivor and Jedi Fallen Order. They suffer from the fact that we already know how the Empire is going to play out. We already know what story is going to be told with that faction. And so you can't do anything truly meaningful to this faction, because Luke Skywalker is not the protagonist of Jedi Survivor, and the last time you checked, you never saw Luke Skywalker gallivanting across the galaxy looking for holocrons and space wizardry schools and, among other things, to essentially, usurp the Empire, among other things, as well as fight an ancient Jedi who then turns evil immediately after resurrecting them. Like, the problem, again, with Star Wars is that a lot of its media is superfluous and rarely ever ties into the grander setting. But with 40k, whereas something like that, my like personal stories like Cal Kestis's might not impact the setting too much, and that kind of takes away from the experience, a little bit. Like because the story with 40K is that everything holds a certain level of weight, but it's all very small in the grander scheme of things. Like, it's the little stories, it's the little things that matter the most at the end of the day when it comes to the 40K setting. Like, humanity is constantly on the back burner when it comes to technological advancement. They're constantly losing technology. They're forgetting even what type of technology they even have half the time, as well as remembering what planets they have and what sort of constituents are currently in their employ. Like, there's a lot of problems with the 40K setting, but it's because of these problems and because of how tied away the setting is from everything else that it allows for itself to have that kind of wiggle room to be able to tell those deeper, more personable stories. So the real problem with the setting, in my opinion, right, is not necessarily on how unaffected the grander scheme of the story is compared to, say, like Star Wars is. Like, nothing that the characters do really affect the setting like it does in the movies with Star Wars, among other things, as well as maybe how Warhammer Fantasy might do it. But rather, like, because of how disconnected everything is, it allows for the focus, the clear focus of just telling individual stories in a way that not only makes sense for that setting, but also feels just as important when you consider that we have all of these heroes, we have all of these characters, these important figures, as well as some other less important ones, all doing and contributing their own part into the greater story that's being told in the war effort. It's just nobody knows about it, nobody's hearing about it, and when you really think about it like this, that just means, right, that stories like Rogue Trader, among other things that seem like they're just kind of tacked onto the setting, these things do at some point, on some level, begin to hold some weight. And that's kind of the majesty of why I think 40K works as a disconnected setting compared to some others. It's because you can tell more interesting and personal stories about whatever factions or unique homebrews you might create that help elevate it into an interesting status or position that makes it worthwhile and worth knowing. It's just nobody's heard about it yet. And that's where I think the true appeal of the setting comes into full scale, right? Is that you can have interesting characters. You can have all of these ever-evolving stories, and you could be the one to tell them. And you don't even need to try that hard. You just need to have the ideas, and they just need to work out. They just need to work well enough in the setting, and the only basic understanding that you need is that there are people with lasguns, there are these people called Cadians, there are other factions that do different things, but otherwise, you just need to have a basic understanding of how certain factions and certain things within that setting works, and suddenly, bam, you have stories and things to work with. All you need to do is just execute them. You could even create your own magic MacGuffin. Space Marines 1 and 2 are all about dealing with warp magical MacGuffins, and for the last time I checked, these were never things that existed in the tabletop version, or at least some of the other expanded lore bits from books or novels, at least not as far as I know. So there's definitely a lot of room, because everything is so wild and uncertain. Like, there's a level of mystery and a level of intrigue here. You can just create things that could easily work in the setting if you so wanted to, and it'd be totally viable. And the best part is that if you find something like, say, like there's a group of humans on a planet who have advanced technology, and that advanced technology is so goddamn destructive that it demands some level of response to that faction on that particular world. Like, the easiest justification as to why they excel better than the Imperium does is just because they have a TCG. They have technology, and they innovate upon their own technologies in such a way to where all of these things can't exist. And that's we're going back to the hallmark, the true beauty of the setting, is that it allows for this level of comfort. It allows for this level of creativity. And that's the ultimate appeal of the setting. Like, far be it from me, like Warhammer, the fantasy setting is probably a good setting because of the fact that it is more grounded. It has like already pre-established mechanisms that make it more recognizable and easily digestible, potentially even, and doesn't allow for that much wiggle room. But because everything is so certain, there's a lot more it's a lot easier to work with as a setting potentially. It's just difficult to find that kind of leg room to really tell a more interesting story in it. And while it certainly offers itself a lot of fun in terms of video games, among other things, among other media, maybe even some stories tell really interesting tales about some people who do certain things for certain reasons, whatever. I don't know. It's kind of hard to really justify anything with this setting because I don't know it or understand it all that well quite yet. But 40K is great because, in my opinion, the way to help to get rid of and potentially lessen this criticism as much as valid of a criticism as it is just by telling more interesting and compelling singular stories about the struggles of a specific chapter of Space Marines, about maybe an Inquisitor who gets sent on a mission to help liberate an entire like solar system from like the tyranny of like some other like human rebel faction or just a human faction that has already conquered the system whole scale and is just a contending power that is against the Imperium and is not a part of the Imperium, and so it must be brought into compliance. There's so many different ways you can tell stories within 40K, and it's all just there. It's all about the creativity. It's all about you having the imagination and the capacity to tell them that makes it that much more worthwhile and that much more amazing to tell it. And it's why I think people often favor games in this setting than they do in the fantasy one, because there's a lot more creative nuance to be had with the 40K side of things than there are on the fantasy side. And that's just my argument and my take on that subject. His criticism is very valid. I think that it's too nebulous. It's far too grand in scale for anything to hold weight, and so you might want to see stories that focus on trying to evolve the overarching story of the God Emperor, of the Imperium of Man, and all these other factions, right? I can understand that reasoning and that logic, because a lot of people want to see things actually change and evolve for the better, like a wholesale. But I think that's only ever going to start happening when we start expanding upon the lore of that. And I think the real beauty of the work is that we need to tell more stories that further help to expand upon and further enrich that setting with more interesting and impressive characters that might help lean the direction for humanity to go in that direction. And that's just my 2 cents on that. I don't think I need to say more about it. I think I've given my reasons, my argument as to help support this idea, this theory, this opinion that he has about the setting. And I think that it's complementary to his criticisms because it's a criticism that I understand and I recognize myself in certain other fictions. And I would like to see people try to bridge the gap between like focusing less on the greater story, take away from the grander narrative that's being told, and try to focus on something a bit more personable. Focus on something that feels a little bit more like that feels a little bit more specific, right? Because it's one thing to flesh out the overall world and narrative, like the overall world and state of things, than it is to like focus on like something more personal, so tell a story that's a bit more like easier to grab onto. Again, I bring this up time and time again. Titus as the focal point for the face of Warhammer only works so well because Warhammer 40K allows it to be so. And because he's in a popular game, he is now the face of 40K as of right now. And so it makes perfect sense to me that you would write stories and characters on a similar level or that help to coincide with the story of Titus, the story of other characters who might be involved, who might become involved with Titus. And I think that, like focusing more on Titus's story and then helping to bring Titus into stories and narratives that go beyond just fighting Tyranids and orcs, among other things, will help to further flesh out and both enlighten more people to the setting of Warhammer than anything else, because Titus is quite literally our bridge into this setting. All right, he was my bridge when I got interested in the setting in the first place, because although I didn't like Space Marines 1 that much, Space Marines 2 helps me recognize there is something truly interesting to be had here. There is something truly awe-inspiring to behold. And so it got me into the setting, and after doing a lot of digging, I realized just how fucking amazing 40k actually is. And that's why I believe we need to tell more stories about really interesting characters, or at least characters who fit the bill for being the poster children, like to be the great vehicles like Titus into the setting that help bridge that gap to help us better understand and to better appreciate the world and the majesty that is Warhammer 40k. And that's just my 2 cents. That is my argument. I have rambled on long enough. I've done that for a good bit now. Let us move on. I'll even back it up a little bit, because I'm sure we are going to want a refresher.
It gives a much better scale of threat than GW having to just keep upping the amount of planets someone conquers to mean anything. There will always be more planets in the Imperium, just conquering one doesn't mean anything for a character. But if some guy and his band of Chaos Goobers take down a city at the edge of the Empire, that can mean something. Depending on what the city was, you can get an actual sense of scale out of that. Another advantage of fantasy's scale is that you can actually get a sense of threat based on where a battle or threat takes place. Space is very big. Realistically speaking, a Chaos incursion taking place 30,000 light years away from Terra is no more of a threat than one taking place 3,000 light years away from it. But the writers of GW are going to make the second one seem worse because it's technically closer, even though in both cases the enemy is still a massive, massive amount of distance away from the throne world. It's space. You can't march an army across the galaxy, no slow attrition warfare across the land. It's just 3,000 is closer than 30,000, therefore that's a big deal, ignoring the fact that realistically speaking, those are both such massive distances with such massive amounts of planets and star systems in the way that they're almost equivalent. But now let's go look at a map of the Empire of Man. Let's say Chaos Raiders are on the coast of Nordland. Who gives a shit? You can probably see Norska from the coastline if the weather permits. Viking raiders coming into pillage is like the first snowfall of the year. It's just part of life. You can tell based on its location that it's not a meaningful threat to the Empire if a Norskan raid goes into Nordland. But let's say the Chaos Raiders are now in Ubersreich, the exact same amount of raiders with the exact same gear and the exact same amount of attention from the Chaos Gods. Without changing the number of invaders or their strength at all, you just scale the threat level up massively, because now they aren't in bumfuck nowhere, they're in the capital province of the Empire and a stone's throw away from Altdorf, the capital city. You can infer so many more things about the threat than in 40k solely based on its location and distance from other locations. One last thing to touch on with the scale before moving on is similar to my first point. With a few exceptions, a location being destroyed in 40k just doesn't mean anything due to how many more near identical versions of the location exist. Oh no, Forge World Hephaestus was destroyed. What will we do? Oh, there's another 1,000 of them. Sure, some worlds will matter more, but there will always be more worlds. There will always be enough Forge Worlds or Agur Worlds or whatever the hell worlds to keep the Imperium at the level of things are getting very bad, but we aren't quite crumbling yet. The only way to make a particular location important is for the writers to say it's important for one reason or another. This Forge World is important because it has a certain tech blueprint. This Agur World is important because it feeds 100 other worlds. And even knowing that, there will always be more planets to fill in the gap. Again, there are exceptions. Cadia blowing up was pretty consequential, to put it mildly, and either of the two passages between the Great Rift falling would certainly be bad news, to say the least. But for the most part, the Imperium can lose 100 planets in a day and it means nothing. Now go back to fantasy. Let's say a horde of beastmen raise a city. Pillars of literal shit erected up to mark the hunting grounds, the Side of Order has no more presence here, victory for chaos. As small a change as that might be in the grand scale of things, it's infinitely more impactful in fantasy because that's it. There's no replacement for that city sitting around the galaxy. There won't be a lost one to find in some forgotten corner of reality. That city's gone, and without a major effort, it won't ever be replaced or come back. Strategic locations and resources mean so much more because there's not another dozen essentially identical versions of them located across the galaxy. A critical fortress world can be destroyed, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's space, you can go around it. But you can't go around Helmgart. Unless you're the Skaven, then you just go under it. To stop rambling on about scale, the characters in Warhammer Fantasy just feel more relatable and appreciable as people. Part of that is probably GW's focus on Marines. I'm not a super soldier soldier in the year 40,000, I don't fight massive battles on the daily. I admit this might just be a me thing, but I find it hard to relate to the demigod son of the Emperor feeling a bit snubbed by his divine daddy. Also, this whole video is about a me thing anyways, but I digress. Even ignoring that, however, the people in 40k almost seem like empty shells. I'm struggling to explain exactly what I mean, so how about I try and pull a valid example? Karl Franz, yeah, I'm sure you could predict that was my example, is the Emperor of the Empire of Man, Prince and Emperor of Reichland, wielder of Galmaraz, and yes, I am going to introduce him with that full set of titles every time I bring him up for the first time in a video. He's a noble warrior and great statesman, but by his own admission in Total Warhammer, he does some dark stuff to keep the Empire safe. A witch hunter can order a town burned to the ground because he thinks a chaos worshipper or vampire might have power there, and he does it with Karl's stamp of approval. But he does this because he cares for his country, his people. This is just the only way he can see the Empire surviving another day. He's motivated by the goodness and patriotism in his heart, even though the deeds he approves of are horrendous. Even the evil characters get a lot of depth like this, with some exceptions. Nagash, Sigvald, all of the Skaven ever. Vlad wants power and to rule the Empire, but he gives at least a bit of a damn about the average human in the world at a level beyond walking, talking blood juice box. Characters in 40k, meanwhile, often just seem to do the things they do because it's expected of them, and relatedly are massive assholes because otherwise the setting wouldn't suck. Why do Space Marines fight chaos? Well, there's so many chapters that it varies, but a lot of the time I get the impression the reason is because that's what they're supposed to do. Do they massacre civilians even though they hate it because they just think they need to? No, not really. They just do that because that's what Marines do. They don't give a damn about humanity or even fellow Space Marines. They just fight because they need to fight. There's no motivation beyond fighting. That's it. A lot of Space Marine chapters commit evil deeds not because it's a necessity, but because they're the dickhead chapter and the dickhead chapter has to be dickheads. They commit evil deeds just because that's their role in life, not because they think this is the only option and they hate every minute of it. And yes, I'm aware they're brainwashed child soldiers, but my viewpoint on that is just because there's a reason for something being boring doesn't make it not boring. It's like when a video game character is made to be annoying on purpose. Good job, you succeeded. I still hate them. A lot of 40k characters also fit templates. This man is a salamander. He's kind to the common man and likes fire. This is an Eldar. She's aloof and mystical and arrogant as all hell, only really caring about herself and other Eldar. There are exceptions, don't get me wrong. Caiaphas Cain and the Gaunt books especially break the mold of their factions. But reading about 40k characters a lot of the time, it seems like they take the standard template for a faction and then add a quirk or two. Fantasy still has templates for characters. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. I'm not going to show that much favoritism. This isn't Halo I'm talking about. But let's look at a few of the high elf characters. There's Teclis, a crippled mage who does his best to keep the realms of man and elf safe, not just his own. There's Eltharion the Grim, the living epitome of a brick wall who cares about nothing but defending his homeland and ensuring that Yvres never falls to orcs like it once nearly did. There's Aletha Nar, who's basically just a spirit of vengeance against dark elves that never got around to dying because he's so damn focused on killing more dark elves he just doesn't age. None of them are anything like each other, and that's ignoring Finnabar, Tyrion, Kalador Dragon Tamer, and all sorts of minor characters. There are two minor high elf characters in a Gotrek and Felix book that to my knowledge never appear in another book, and each of them were completely distinct from anyone else. In fantasy, not only are the characters more relatable, but they don't feel nearly as reliant on templates. Templates still exist, but it feels like they don't to anywhere near the same extent. Something else about fantasy I personally find appealing is that its history is fairly concise and laid out. Now, I'm not that much of a fool. I know that 40k's vibe of history and culture being lost and forgotten is a major part of the setting, especially the Imperium. And the setting as a whole would certainly be lesser if that wasn't the case. But I'm still a silly guy who majored in history. I like seeing the entire chain of events leading into one another, reading about the people and revolutions that changed the world, and with fantasy, you get exactly that. There's still some mystery, like precisely what the old ones were doing beyond preparing for chaos, or how exactly the Skaven came about, given that there's like 5 different accounts from the doom of Kavzar to the sea god cursing some sailors. But everything from Sigmar's rise to the War of the Beard to Nagash are all fairly well accounted for. You can read exactly why elves and dwarves hate each other, just how Malekith's rise to power went down. There's little theory crafting or anything like it involved. That too has its downsides in that there's much less interesting debates and theories to discuss, but like I said earlier, this is a matter of taste. And also, like I said earlier, just because there's a reason something is the way that it is doesn't mean I have to like it.
I think he does, again, bring up a valid point. And I think that, again, it just further expands upon what I was just saying. You know, like, I think that what he just described is that there aren't enough appealing character-focused narratives and stories that make the setting feel like the weight of these characters have more impact than they should. I feel like that, yes, the templates are a thing that is focused on a lot in the 40k setting, but that's only because they are the templates. You know, like, they focus more so on giving you a vibe and a feel, which is easy to gravitate towards when you're just getting into the setting, as well as when you're just trying to understand what it is that these factions do and what these chapters are about, especially when you consider Space Marines, because they have a fuck ton of chapters. not just of the first founding and the second, but they have a third, and I think they have a fourth, and then there's a bunch of other spin-off shits that go into all of that. You know, like there are a lot of Space Marine factions, Space Marine legions, just chapters alone that it's mind-numbing. You could probably have, the Imperium could probably have an entire army just focus on Space Marines by themselves, and they could be the pinnacle of their entire war effort. You don't even need humans by that point. You don't even need Cadians. You just need all of these fucking Space Marine chapters to be focused on doing one thing the best, and that's defending this planet, staving off this enemy force, doing this thing, that thing, and it'd be totally viable. Because it makes perfect fucking sense. Why wouldn't you use the genetically modified, bioengineered, enhanced super soldiers with fucking tank armor to go do the job that about 10,000 or so Cadians could do within, like, the fraction of the cost? It's like you have all of the things you could possibly do with the factions and the soldiers. You just need to do it. But that's the beauty of it, is that they just fucking don't. But anyways, I'm getting besides the point now. The point that I'm getting to is that if the problem is that the templates are the issue, and that the chapters are a little bit too disconnected, and that every character featured in chapters don't really work outside of their initial templates, then I think the obvious thing to do would be to expand upon it, right? Just develop them more, make them more interesting characters. You know, like the beauty of of what I was saying earlier is that if you, like, for example, when I was playing Space Marines 1, one of the things that I commented on was that Titus's story in Space Marines 1 was very much the same problem. You know, like, he was very much a Boy Scout. You know, he was a true Ultramarine, as an Ultramarine should. And he probably became captain because he was such a fucking good boy. You know, like, Titus is a Ultramarine. He is Gilliman's son. And that is ultimately the point of his character. But where they, you know, Space Marines 1 was more so about, like, focusing on the action set pieces, doing cool bits, and just needing to fight chaos, slay a bunch of orcs in between all of that, you know, and prevent another raptioning from happening in the middle of buttfuck nowhere with this Bagria situation, among other things. You know, like, and uncovering chaos plots among, you know, other fuck shit. You know, like, Titus, you know, like, learns and grows as a character as a result of this whole experience. You know, like, he trusted in the wisdom and in the idea of Inquisitor Drogon. He respected his station. He respected his leadership. He respected his inputs, as any true Ultramarine might as well should have, because he is of the Imperium. He is a physical representation of the very thing he fights to maintain. You know, like, he's going to value the opinion of Inquisitor Drogon, as well as his continued, you know, I wouldn't say what is the word I'm looking for here? His continued camaraderie and companionship, as well as just his basically his efforts into the war effort about as much as any other Ultramarine, and he's going to treat it with the level of decorum and ethical care that it reasonably should. And that's why even when he was helping Drogon with arming his device, with helping him man his machines, among other things, you know, like, he was still critical about some of the strategies he would try to employ to get there. You know, like, he was just like, just give me the warp stone, Titus, and that way we could just get this whole thing going right there. And then it's just like, no. I will take the thing, because if the orcs see that I have the warp stone and you don't have the warp stone, then the likelihood of it being snatched away from you in our attempts to just hurry this process along will not be null and void. And as long as they see me with the warp stone and they're trying to attack me and antagonize me by trying to steal it from me by killing me, like you can get the machine set up, and then I can take the time of killing more orcs on the way there, and it works for both parties, so to speak. I get to help the Cadians, I can help with the war efforts, and on top of that, I can make the orcs feel bad while doing it. You can prepare the machine for when I eventually make my way over to it, and then we could just get the whole show on the road. Like it makes logical sense, both somewhat tactically, but it more so works in the sense that Inquisitor Drogon is just a guy in like human-sized power armor. He's not that equipped to handle orcs, and Titus, being the captain that he is and being someone who's good at making decisions, he knows about how to handle strategies, and he's good on thinking on the fly. And not only that, but he's just really fucking good at killing things. It's almost like he's biologically engineered to do that. Like it just makes sense. But again, I'm focusing on the stupid shit. Yeah, at the end of the day, Titus goes from being an Ultramarine to then being betrayed by Inquisitor Drogon, as laughable and as easy to see coming as that is. But he then goes from learning from that experience to then being betrayed again by Leandros when Leandros rats him out to the Inquisition, and so he is then taken away, questioned for being a heretic. It's a fucking travesty into itself, because, again, Titus, being the good boy that he is, he could not believe the almost the heresy levels of heresy of accusing him of being accused of being a heretic. It's like, it's blasphemous not only to him, it's blasphemous to anyone who probably knows him. If Sidonis was alive, he'd probably be looking at Leandros just like, the fuck are you doing? It's just like, Titus is a captain. He's a captain of the Second Company. And on top of that, he, like, knowing how the setting works, he probably didn't get there because he was just that stupid, or because he was just that good of a guy. Like, he probably got there because of all of the things that made Space Marines 1 so great. He's good at making quick on-the-fly thinking. He's great tactically speaking. Like, he knows how to kill things a lot harder than most others. Like, he's very experienced in both combat and strategy. He is what every Ultramarine should aspire to be, but Leandros only saw the potential heresy in his physiology, in the quandary that was him being able to hold the warp stone, and just ran away with that as being like, it can only mean one thing. And it's the level of the skepticism that, like, it's that level of witch hunt fuckery that often plagues the setting for what it is. But nevertheless, Titus then goes from being like that perfect Ultramarine, right? He goes from being that stellar guy to then, after spending at least 200 years with the Death Watch, he then comes back finally home to his brothers in the Second Company, after, many new faces and many new changes here, along with the fact that there's a new captain on board. He is now a lieutenant in the Second Company, and now he has to work with the new captain, Akaran, who basically is telling him how, like, what needs to be done, how to best do it, like, what the strategies at play, and he needs to follow the orders. And that's not necessarily bad, because he was likely already doing that to begin with. The problem, of course, is that his existence for why he came back from the Death Watch in the first place, on top of his reasons for being in it, is now a question that is going to be on everybody's minds. And so, after everything he has suffered, just to return back to being an Ultramarine, he's not all that willing to be as forthcoming about himself or about his reasons for why he is the way that he is, and why he came back from the Death Watch, among other things, or even why he even went to the Death Watch. He just doesn't want to talk about those things. It makes sense that he doesn't want to talk about those things, and why he was kind of a bit standoffish, because he's been betrayed before. He's been betrayed not just once, but twice on the same fucking day. The guy doesn't want to talk about himself, because any hope and chance that there might be an understanding went out the window as soon as Gadriel is just like, the Codex Astartes does not support this action. It's it all plays into this pretty perfect little picture. I say perfect, but in this pretty little picture of how there is conflict, there is absolutely some level of just like skepticism on both parties. Like Titus doesn't think he can trust his brothers with the information of knowing that he was a Black Shield and he got accused of heresy because he just has an innate resistance to the warp energies that bind the world of both the mortal one and of the chaos one. And he knows that if they were to know this information even just the moment he met them, they probably would question everything he does, and they would be doing the same thing that Leandros was doing throughout the entirety of Space Marines 1. He is completely valid for this, but at the same time, right, it's also understandable that his compatriots would be frustrated with Titus, because not only is he not that forthcoming about why he makes decisions and where these decisions are based from, but he doesn't like talking about himself, and he doesn't like being, he's just not a chatty guy. He isn't one of the bros, all right? He has yet to establish himself as a solid bro, and he is not a bro. So he's failed the vibe check, so to speak. And so there's a lot of reasons why both sides pick at each other like bears, waiting to see which one's gonna fucking, get pissed off first or next. And Titus won the pissing contest because out of the three of them, Titus was very reasonable and was very on the point the entire way through, and even had to deal with their bullshit along the way. Got a little short with them in some instances, but ultimately kept his cool. He kept the mission as the focus. And then when they got out of line, he reminded them very simply and sometimes passive-aggressively to get their shit together. And, that is entirely true. That is entirely valid. That is a very worthwhile thing to do as a commander. Make sure that your boys are not flying off the handle and that they're constantly in their place, that they understand what they're about, what they're supposed to be doing, and not go on stupid tirades or tangents and kind of like what I'm doing. But it's like he keeps them focused on the mission and leaves any personal petty grievances at the door front. And though that kind of got him into some hot water, and when the question of him being a heretic was then asserted, and Gadriel and I can't even remember the other guy's name now. Gadriel and what was it? Carl? I can't even remember. Charon, I think. When the question of his heresy came into question after everything that has been built up, after everything they think that they know, that they thought that they know, it eventually exploded into this big fucking thing where it was like Titus is now being attacked by Gadriel, almost shot in the face, until Charon takes out his bolt pistol, shoots the chick who was accusing him of heresy in the face, I think. I don't know where he shot her. And when his excuse was, I was on Calth when shit hit the fan, potentially, by the way, making him one of the oldest Space Marines in the entirety of the Legion, by the way. But, he says he was on Calth when it went up. He's seen the Ward Bearers and how they operate, so he knows a thing or two about chaos and heresy, and as well as their corrupting influence. And so he recognized and he knew, right, that Titus is not about that bullshit. And so, that weird lore justification aside, he shot the seer and thus further vindicated Titus of him being a heretic. And then, again, Titus had to do the usual thing of making sure that Gadriel understood exactly what he attempted to do, and also reaffirmed the status of his allegiance unquestioning. It was all a big fucking deal, but it all led to this one beautiful scene near the end of the game where the bros finally see where everybody's coming from. All of this shit has been thrown out, and then they have this nice, tender, brotherly moments where they're all just sitting there, and they're just like, I'm ready to jump out this thing with you. And though the Codex Astartes does not approve of this action, I am certainly looking forward to it. And they have this epic down to the planet's surface level jump, like in Space Marines 1, the iconic moment that set the stage for the first game, now setting the stage for what would be the climax of the end game of the second game. And it was this great send-off all the way up until the last act, which, though debatable, it was still a pretty cool boss fight. Everything got wrapped up nicely in this beautiful little bow. We even got Papa Smurf to show up. You know, we got Calgar to show up. And also now affirming another interesting connection that Titus has, which is that he knows Calgar to some level. And then we had seen that entire story get wrapped up between Charon and Gadriel and Titus. And then Titus then goes on to do some other shit with Leandros and Calgar, set on a new mission for whatever reason. And one that was made on behalf of Leandros, as fucking annoying as that sounds. And then the only time we ever see Titus again is in the secret level, where he is now far more experienced. He's far more grizzled a little bit. He doesn't have nearly the same level of chip that he did when he came back to the Ultramarines after the first game and the history between the two titles. And now he's just like this very experienced, very like, you know, very almost what is the word to describe it? He's a very decorated almost character. Like, he's a character who's seen it all, and Secret Level portrays him as such. You know, like, he's a character who was once recruited to the Ultramarines for having literally no fear whatsoever. And then it is the Secret Level episode ends with Titus basically proving why he is as good as an Ultramarine as he is, by further expanding on the fact that, yes, he has resistance against warp energies, but he's also not just resistant to it, he's also mind resistant to it as well. The man has no fear. The Chaos tries to use that to basically try to warp Titus into essentially giving in to his baser desires, but the only thing that was there was just his murderous intent. He was able to basically fight through the sort of like warp sort of mindfuckery that the demon was trying to exude onto Titus, because it tried to play into his fear, which he had none. And so he proceeded to kill the demon after breaking through its hold on him, and proceeded, right, to then go off and fight against the never-ending onslaught of traitors and heretics, potentially to go on to do some next grandiose like adventure and mission that's probably going to equally as likely to get him killed, because this particular secret level mission was a suicide mission. It was designed particularly so that way the people who participated in it probably weren't going to come back alive. And I wouldn't be surprised if Titus's choosing of that, you know, for that mission was not on behalf of Leandros, and I would not also be surprised if, you know, the old man who had recruited him all those years ago into the chapter, being on that same mission, wasn't also just a nice pointed way for Leandros to get another dig at Titus, being like, fuck you, and fuck everything you represent, fuck everything you stand for, fuck you, you absolute piece of shit, why can't you just die? I know you're a heretic, just die, damn it, die. Anyways, I went on the whole tirade about this. I apologize. I did go on a whole tirade about a criticism on an opinion and a criticism of a particular issue, but returning back to the overall point, I think that Pancreas has an absolute point. He has the best point, okay? This is not at all a criticism of a criticism by Pancreas or Pancreas himself. I think his point is absolutely valid. I just think we need more stories about more characters that focus on fleshing them out, making them more integral to the plot, and making them more interesting as characters as a result. We just need to make more interesting characters for the setting, so that way when they die and they eventually potentially lose a battle, or they suffer, or they potentially, you know, like, again, they die like Sanguinius does, we really, we start to really feel it. I think that in order to make the setting feel more impactful, we need to have more impacting characters that don't just affect the setting on a grand scale, but also on a personable one, right? Like, Titus's story is very one note. It is very singular to the overall scope of the 40K lore and grander scheme of the war efforts, among other things. Like, he is just a cog in this machine, but Titus's story is only as good as it is, and his characterization is only as great as it is because his story focuses on focuses on the problems of the Imperium, why it would have negative effects on those who are actually just really good at their jobs, why Titus is such a great character, and the potential for him to become an even greater character as a result of this. Like, Titus has grown from being a simple captain to being this very decorated, very venerated, and very special Ultramarine, this special little son of Gilliman, who he's just so spiteful and has such a massive hate boner for anything that isn't human, right? He's so good at what he does. He's so good at murdering things, at being a captain, at leadership, that it would seem like the setting would become inferior if something were to happen to Titus. And because now he is the face of 40K, he has become ultimately the face of Warhammer 40K to the common rabble of people who have likely gotten into the setting because of the game, right? Now all of the casual Andys, the casual Babbies who have played the game, who are now interested in the setting, are going to be severely feel like they're going to have something taken away if Titus were to suddenly just up and die in another story, right? Like, the whole point that I am trying to make is that in order to compact this, to counteract this problem of the setting being too grand in scope, of being too big to really have any individual stories have meaning, is to make those individual stories have meaning, that it goes beyond than just the Imperium one. Like, the potential for something greater, the potential for something more, the potential for Titus to be something more. Like, imagine if in the next Space Marines game, right, Space Marines 3, Titus doesn't just prove that he is, like, not just, like, really good at being a leader and, all the things that made him a captain in the first place, like, again, time and time and again, but he's able to do it consistently, but also prove that his loyalty is unshakable. Like, he becomes so good at what he does, and he is so resolute in how he does it, like, that his faith in his leadership, I am getting lost again in the sauce. I am getting too focused on certain aspects of the character now. But anyways, the point is that Titus gets so good at basically, like, solving every problem thrown his way, meeting every challenge with unflinching resolve, and proving himself to be loyal to the Imperium to such a significant degree that he just becomes acquitted of all charges, and everyone just thinks Leandros is just a fucking little bitch, and like he always was, and just everyone who treats him as such. And then Titus in Space Marines 3 goes on from being just an Ultramarine to then just deciding, maybe I'll just start my own chapter. Maybe I'll create my own successor chapter. Maybe I'll create my own successor chapter and I'll call it something new. I'll call it something unique. Maybe I'll call it something much, like, maybe I'll do something that helps disenfranchise Space Marines from other legions, right? To basically, like, be shepherded into this one chapter and create this weird amalgamation of other Space Marines that essentially does the job that nobody else wants to do, right? They're just on the same par of skill and quality and leadership as like some of the Death Watch, as well as most Ultramarines, but also they do it just as well as like some of the chapters who are known for doing these things, right? Like it's an amalgamation of a lot of things. Like imagine Titus starting a chapter where a successor chapter where he basically has like Marines from the fucking Raven Guard, from the Salamanders to all these other factions, all in one successor chapter. He starts his own chapter. All these people come in, and you can then tell a news story about a group of misfits trying to get along and trying to be brothers despite their differences, and finding how to be so, even in spite of their different approaches and tactics to combat, among other things. And how Titus, again, proves himself to be exemplary by then further showing us his qualities as a leader, by then putting everyone's opinions and qualms aside and focusing on the strategies that make the most sense and are proven to be the most reliable given the circumstances. Like, again, another Space Marine story where we can see Titus again show us why he is just doing the most. He is just the best Space Marine, and it's even better too because then GW can have its cake and eat it too because he's an Ultramarine. Like it all stems from the fact that he's a son of Gilliman. Gilliman is a great leader, and Titus just happens to be just really good at surviving, making the best decisions in every circumstances, and is just a really great at murdering things because he's genetically and biologically engineered to do so. Again, working with other people who are basically built to do the exact same shit, just in different ways. Like it all works and coincides. It all comes together into this beautiful little bow, and I just gave GW the potential idea for a plot of another game. I will not be accepting any royalties. Feel free to steal it if you want, GW. You fucking greedy sons of bitches, you. But anyways, that is a long tangent. Just to say that his criticisms are appropriate, but only because no one who has gotten their hands on this IP has written stories that focus on further expanding upon and really developing certain characters that launch itself into the proverbial mainstream, that make it cooler, that make it way more interesting. I mean, like, we have many novels and stories that try to flesh out the Primarchs, among other things, right? But these are stories that focus on things and characters who actually hold some real weight and significance in the setting. That's understandable. But where I think GW might want to try to focus going forward from here on out is then giving people the ability to focus on telling more unique stories that are very personable but integral to not really necessarily the overarching grandiose scheme of the setting, not just the overall setting itself, but rather a more personal story about how maybe a group of Space Marines need to liberate a planet from a bunch of orcs wholesale, but don't know the best means of which to do that. Maybe they create a new form of virus bomb that helps to target the fungi-like nature which these orcs stem from, and completely sanitize and I guess you can say what is the word? Purge them from the world, I guess, in the more appropriate fashion that it would be used for. And because of this weird invention that this virus bomb is, maybe they don't learn, maybe it's not necessarily technology that is learned, of course, because I know how the setting works, right? So maybe at one point humanity came across the orcs at some points, like they probably more than likely did. They then fought against them. They realized they are more like a fungi type species, and so they realized that through genetic engineering, they created They created a bomb that helps to. I've been sitting here for so long that the goddamn computer went into sleep mode. They create a virus bomb that counteracts the fungi-like growth nature of the orcs, eliminating them both not just wholesale, but on a microscopic level as well. they employ it, and this new discovery allows them to further counteract the orc tide, the orc was and the orc tides that much more, adding more stakes to the setting, adding more of an interesting story on top of adding another aspect that kind of evolves the setting just a little bit. I don't know. It's the sky's the limits, but I think it's just more so like telling more interesting stories, using more interesting characters is what people should be focusing on. You know, the stakes and the reasons for the story don't have to matter too much. It's more so just about telling more personable stories involving interesting characters doing interesting things, I suppose. But anyways, I went on this whole tangent. I do apologize for that. I did it more than once. I did it 3 times on this fucking video, I think. So that turned this video a lot longer than just the 13-minute mark. Of course, I do this for a 13-minute video about a criticism about the differences between fantasy and futuristic sci-fi, grimdark future Warhammer 40k. It's God. And again, I don't disagree with Pancreas. I don't disagree with the ideas that are presented, with his criticisms, with his arguments. I think that the easiest way to alleviate these criticisms, and again, these are valid criticisms that he absolutely has, and that I believe is true without question, because I do see that problem, especially now since he bothers to bring it up. I think that the simplest issue is to just write better stories, more singular stories, more narrative-focused stories about specific characters doing things that are interesting, and also make characters that are equally as interesting to helm those stories. And that should just alleviate this problem entirely. And I went on a whole tirade tangent about it, not just once, but twice. All right, take from all my ramblings what you will. I am doing the most because I am an amateur writer and I am a fucking moron. I love to get completely wrapped up in these types of questions and these types of discussions because as someone who loves pop culture and pop culture media, I am someone who has his own personal opinions and gripes about story conventions, writing conventions, gameplay conventions, among other things. I have my own opinions about certain things, and I already have answers to questions that I have considered time and time again, and I'm just putting my 2 cents in there, all right? And this is from an amateur writer's perspective. I am not a writer. I am not someone who has ever published anything, so take for it what you will, with as much grain of salt as you would like. I'm just telling you what I think, and what I think is that you just need more interesting stories with more interesting characters. At the end of the day, if there's nothing that you could take away from everything I've said, it's that. And with that being said, let's just continue and finish this video. I will not talk the rest of the way. I have tangented enough as is. Let Pancreas have his arguments and me shutting the fuck up.
Downsides is that there's much less interesting debates and theories to discuss, but like I said earlier, this is a matter of taste. And also, like I said earlier, just because there's a reason something is the way that it is, doesn't mean I have to like it. Sue me. And finally, I just think fantasy has better games. I know, a very weak point, but this whole video is subjective, so why don't I end on something that's 110% subjective, as opposed to the rest of this video just being 100% subjective. The Total War, Warhammer, and Vermintide games absolutely knock it out of the park. By quantity, I think 40k has more good games, and it has some absolute bangers, don't get me wrong. I mean, anyone who's a fan of RTS games that doesn't think Dawn of War is amazing either hasn't played it or is lying to you. Space Marine is a fun little snacky third-person shooter, and Mechanicus I'm sure needs no introduction. But out of the enjoyment I've gotten out of the games, fantasy has it won by a long shot. A lot of people started learning new hobbies and skills in 2020 when we were all stuck at home, from cooking to even painting miniatures, more related to the hobby. I woke up, booted up Steam, and played Total Warhammer 2 for 8 hours. Summer 2020 was the summer of Total Warhammer for me. And I think I'm wrapped up here. That's all my major reasons for why I think fantasy is better than 40k. Do keep in mind I've been specifically referring to Warhammer Fantasy and not Age of Sigmar, because some of the things I said about the scale of the setting, for instance, apply just as well to AOS as they do to 40k. And with that, I think I'm also out of strawman arguments I can think of to defend myself with. Either way, do let me know in the comments why whatever Warhammer setting you like the most is your favorite. I'm happy to read them, because this is all about personal enjoyment, and I love to hear what makes people interested in the setting they chose to champion. Malekith is coming out soon. This should be going up before that's out. Don't tell anyone I told you this one, but me and some other fellas have some Necron stuff stuff coming out soon, more on that to come. Shout out again to Barry Waltz for gifting me that wonderful little subscribe notification. He's a real pal. Go sub to Brigingo Waltathan. Thank you, of course, to my wonderful channel members. You are the Galmaraz to my Warhammer. Without you, it just wouldn't be the same around here. If you'd like to support the channel, consider subscribing or becoming a member. Either way, thanks for watching and take care out there. And of course, Dami Mami Marathi is in fantasy, therefore making it the best setting by default. My parents once said to make sure I don't put anything that might harm me on YouTube in one way or another, nothing that'll be embarrassing for me in the future. And for when more of my family finally finds this channel, I'd just like to say this in response to that. You would need the force of 10,000 industrial strength cranes to pull my tongue out of Marathi's asshole.
Anyways, it's a great video. In between my stupid ramblings, it was a great video. Please go support the original video if you got lost in his overall criticism, because, I spent hours, it feels like, just dissecting his arguments. And then further expanding upon it, I think, if nothing else, that's a great fucking reason to go watch the original video. Please go watch and support the original video. Pancreas No Work does great content. I only just now seen maybe a few videos by this guy. I remember watching a couple of videos on my main channel, my actual account that is not this channel, to about some of his 40k takes, among other things, but they were very few and far between. But he is someone who seems to really know what he's talking about. He's clearly someone who loves and appreciates not just 40k, but also Warhammer as an entity, as a franchise, and he clearly likes the fantasy elements just a slight bit more than the 40k ones, and that is entirely valid. And I have nothing really negative or even anything critical to say about it. And again, this is all just his opinion. I don't think he should ever be knocked for having an opinion. We know what the internet's like when you get knocked for having an opinion and what people do when they're petty enough to do that. But anyways, I am not that kind of person. I think his opinion is valid. I think his criticisms are valid. In fact, I thought they were so valid, I went on several tirades just to further expand upon it. So yes. And if Pancreas happens to watch this video, my guy, I feel bad for you. I do. I feel so bad, feel so sorry for you. You basically had to sit here listening to a random shitter on the internet with a VTuber model basically rant and rave about how your argument is certainly not invalid for like the longest stretch of time. I feel so bad for you. For something that was just originally a 13-minute video, you get to listen to someone ramble ad nauseum about 40k and how your argument is truly a right one, even if it got kind of lost in between with me getting into more specific bits to further expand and elaborate on that point. But anyways, yes, I am a random YouTuber, a VTuber, a random shitter on the internet. I don't know if you know who I am. I don't know if you know what VTubers are like, but I'm just letting you know. I can't speak for some of my male brethren because I don't watch them, but there are plenty of female ones who are in this space, and I don't think they've seen your content quite yet, but they very may well end up doing so in the future. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and leave it there. In the meantime, it is currently, at the recording of this stream, about 3 hours going on about to be 4. I'm going to go grab a snack, I'm going to go grab some drinks, and then we'll move on to the next one, which is going to be, surprisingly, a Fat Electrician video. So, God, let's see how much mileage I'm going to get out of this one. Hey, right, guys? I've turned a 13-minute video into possibly a hour to 2 hour video. Fuck. Anyways, I'll be right back. 1 second. Jesus Christ.